Marc Lowenstein, composer, conductor, and instructor. I'm glad we could have some time to talk about your participation with Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra's Sound Investment Commission. And I want to find out first and foremost, how much did you know about this program before getting involved, and how did your participation in it come to be?
Well, I know quite a bit about it. I'm very good friends with Ellen Reed, who has been a sound investment composer and who also helps advise LACO. And they're really good about not hiring friends. But I sort of snuck in because I had sort of been, I trade war stories and like in composition talk with Ellen all the time. I'm a big fan of her music. And so I believe she suggested me as one, and then that wasn't enough. I think I went through some hoops. I have no idea. And I got a call, and this is sort of in the middle of COVID when they said, we think we'll be open by then. And in fact, they were open by then. And so I'm thrilled. I mean, I've listened to LACO forever. I love the band. They're unique, and they're certainly unique in the Los Angeles atmosphere. They're a true chamber orchestra. They play together, and they they play like they like each other. If you know what I mean. And I think they do, which is a wonderful thing. So, I mean, I'm very excited about the piece and hearing it come to life with this particular group.
Now, for people who aren't familiar with the Sound Investment Commission, it works a little bit differently than if you had gotten a commission from another
Right.
performing arts organization, in that the people who donate into this program get to have, a number of meetings with you, progress reports, hearing bits and pieces of a work in progress. I assume that's very different than with any other institution.
Very, very different. Although having said that, in my work in the industry, we do something sort of similar in that we do workshops and we have our donors come to the workshops and we have meet and greets with them. But that's not formalized in the way the sound investment program is. And it's really formalized in a good sense in that, first I met and talked about my initial ideas, then I met and had a small group of musicians play some excerpts just to check them out. And to see if I could coerce one of the violins into singing, which is a whole nother issue. But I'll tell you about that later. And then there's one more meeting with donors right after one of the dress rehearsals. So they get to see the evolution from idea to piece and to performance.
How expressive are they with their comments, their opinions of what they're experiencing?
They're very smart. Let me put it that way. They ask very intelligent questions. They seem to be very, very perceptive. There's obviously, as in any group of people, a wide degree of what would I call notational literacy, where some people, sometimes the most expressive and perceptive questions come from people who are not notationally literate. And those are sort of in the most fun ones. And other people are just much more interested in the details. Like, wow, what's that sound? How did you write that? What did that seem to express for you?
What is the demographic of this group? Because I'm having an image. LACO does this wonderful job of balancing playing traditional
Yeah.
classical music with playing newer works and giving world premiere of works. So
Mhm.
there, on one hand, there's a part of me that thinks, oh, it's LACO, it's going to be a much older demographic. But if I think of modern classical music, I think it's probably skewing younger. Probably the reality is somewhere in between.
I think the reality is somewhere in between. I mean, look, it's not unique. In every orchestra organization wrestles with demographic. And, when they feel like, oh, the young people aren't coming, at least they'll come in 30 years from now when they're reach our demographic or something like that. So it definitely skews a little older, but you're right in that the modern music does bring in a slightly younger demographic. And LACO also does a really good job. Like I think almost every orchestra does this now because there's such an educational imperative in our society now. And LACO does a great job of, they have an education director, they have an education artistic director. They're really good about getting out to the schools. I don't, that hasn't quite translated into concert attendance yet. And I'm not only talking about LACO, I'm talking about all the orchestras yet, but it's a very long-term project. And I think it's a necessity. And I think LACO is a vital part of that.
Well, it is a necessity, because if we don't have contemporary works, how many Beethoven cycles can someone sit through?
Oh my goodness, no. And I don't know. I mean, I'm slightly older, shall we say. So I don't think people realize what a renaissance of modern orchestral music there is going on now today. and such a broad array of composers, different styles. When I was coming up, and I mean, I've always had a sort of tripartite career, primarily as a teacher and then as a conductor and as a sort of institutional organizer, and then also as a composer. But 30 years ago, you just couldn't get your music performed by any orchestra. They would do, their idea of modern music was, you know, one piece by an extremely famous person, and that would anchor the season. And now it's like, it seems like almost every concert by every major orchestra has a really interesting piece. And, you know, even if it's not successful, it's fabulous to hear. I mean, that's, you just need the throughput to, as you say, to discover those Beethovens. So I think we're really in a tremendous renaissance of hearing a broad array of new voices of sort of all ages and backgrounds and all musical styles. And that's, I think that's crucial.
And of course, if we're talking 30 years ago by one famous composer, it was either Philip Glass or John Adams.
Yes, I wasn't going to mention names, but yes. which, hey, I like them both. Don't
I
get
do
me.
too. I do too.
Yeah. No, but I remember talking to my peers. It's like, how do you get formed? And all of us essentially made our own groups and our own orchestras to play the works. But there was still a barrier, and I think part of it was it wasn't necessarily a lack of awareness. It was sort of a blinkered mindset on the boards of all those institutions. And the boards have changed, and they realize that A, there's all this great music out there, and B, a lot of those sort of scrappy institutions have pushed a lot of really interesting music to the fore, and C, there's a lot of great young composers out there. I mean, I'm thrilled because the sound investment program isn't just for young composers. I'm not exactly a young composer. I kind of joke I'm sort of a mid-career, even despite my age, because I'm mid-career in all these three different aspects that I do all the time. So I haven't written as much as many other composers my age, but at the same time, it's refreshing that sound investment will have very young and untried composers with tremendous amount of promise, and then somewhat older, more experienced. It's just whoever they find interesting. And as you look down the Laco catalog, it's a really interesting mix, and I'm very proud to be associated with it.
Well, and let's be realistic. The way of the world requires any composer, regardless of age at this point, to have a commission,
Yeah.
you know, to be able to do something.
Yeah,
So that's not relegated to just those who are up and coming.
definitely. No, absolutely. It's a very good point too. And of course, the challenge is always not just the commission, but the second and third performances.
Which we will talk about a little bit later in our conversation.
Absolutely.
So what can you tell me about the work? Because I am not foolish enough to even pretend that I know what the name is, even though I can see it in print. I am not going to set myself up for that kind of failure.
No, that's okay. You know, it had an English title, and I'm not that religious, but when I am, I feel marginally drawn to the sort of the Jewish mysticism tradition and where it intersects with Buddhism. It's not very original of me, but it's just sort of, it's where I sit. And so the piece itself is about nostalgia. I mean, let me back up a little bit, because I have to explain the title, and then I'll get to the actual title. Writing for Laco was such an opportunity. They have such an amazing sound. And again, they sort of breathe together as an orchestra. They know each other. They like each other. They just have a sound. And I've written music in a bunch of different styles. I think every composer, you have to be able to write in different styles. And that makes it sometimes difficult to synthesize into what this one piece is going to be. And I envy people who have an easy time at that. I know some great composers who have an easy time. I don't. So I decided, since I love their classical and their modern repertoire, I wanted to try to sit in between them. So there's a lot of sounds that are very traditional. It's sort of, I grew up, like, my roots in terms of what I heard as a young person is sort of romantic chamber music and classical orchestra. And then I moved into jazz. So the beginning is sort of Schumann meets Sibelius meets Charles Mingus in this sort of wild party. And then I realized, though, that in writing all these nostalgic styles, in some ways nostalgia is this beautiful thing, and another way nostalgia is the enemy, because you can sort of drown in nostalgia unless you make something new out of nostalgia. It can really hold you back, and I'm not even talking musically now, I'm talking psychologically. But I think the two are related. And also, I think if you worry too much about the future, you're also holding yourself back. You're not living in the present in that sense. In other words, if you, so musically speaking, if you try to be cutting edge, you're never going to be, everything's been done. So it's this weird search for honesty between those and other poles, between nostalgia and the sort of attempt to be new. And I realized that writing the piece, that's sort of what the psychology of the piece and the actual musical language of the piece is about. So I wanted to have some title that would evoke the present time, sort of that which is searched, like, I'm going to use that overused word, a sort of mindfulness of the present. I don't really think in those terms, but in other words, how to just focus on what is right now. And so initially the piece was going to be called something like Now, and it's just like, oh, I just didn't read. And then I realized there is something in the Jewish liturgy. There's a very common prayer. Every time you reach a milestone, whether it's just a happy day, a holiday, something like this, there's a blessing you recite, sort of thanking God for bringing you to the moment, to this moment. And in Hebrew, the words for this moment is HaZ'man, HaZeh, which literally means this time or the present time. And so I decided, like, hey, maybe I'll have a foreign word for my title, because that way it'll be more pretentious. I mean, that's not exactly what I thought, but it escapes the sort of the pedestrian associations with calling the piece like the present time or something like that, because it sounds like a newspaper then. And this was a little closer. So it has that kind of, is the piece Jewish? I don't think so, but maybe, I don't know. So it has that connotation of the constant search for what's going on in the present. And so at one point, I think one way to really live in the present is to sort of dance. And there is this definite, in all my music, there's this binary between song and dance, and they sort of fuse together. And so about 2/3 of the way to the piece, it sort of busts out into a dance. Pretty much I was improvising on the piano, and my wonderful 8-year-old daughter just looked at me like, Daddy, did you write that? And it's like, yes. So like, it's pretty good. And so it's like, well, from the mouths of an 8-year-old. So that actually became the basis. And I was just sort of improvising around a theme and something like that. And I got the approval of my daughter. So that became the dance. And I played a lot of sort of gypsy Balkan music before, as well as Sephardic Jewish music, and sort of from all over, in addition to swing dancing, jazz, whatever, classical dance. And so the best way to describe it is sort of a Balkan samba in 7/16, and sort of the whole orchestra busts loose, and there's a big clarinet solo. And then, but even that sort of wasn't enough for me in terms of describing the present. There's something very present about being the dance. And then I thought, it's really, this always happens when you write music. Like, there's this big energy, and then what? And it's the problem. Like, look, I'm not Stravinsky, but the real difficulty, you can tell the difficulty that Stravinsky had in ending The Rite of Spring. That ending where it goes like, and then bump. It's like, no, this doesn't work. So that problem after that big energy. And then I realized that there was another thing. There was actually a song I had been working on at the same time. And in parallel, I didn't think it was part of this piece. It was just, I just write songs on my own. And I'd been writing songs on sort of words from the Dalai Lama, who's sort of can you have metaphysical heroes? If he's a metaphysical hero, he's one of my metaphysical heroes in life, in terms of what he's been through in his early life, and his sort of attitude about kindness as a way towards compassion and to being in the present time. And I can only vaguely aspire to it. So I had been setting this sort of meditation on one of his sayings, which is, my religion is kindness. And so I actually kind of heard the song come in, and I was planning the dance. I didn't know what to happen. I was like, well, I'm working on this song, can I take this block and just move it right here? And it's great. And I think it works. And so I did. And then I call up the orchestra manager, and I said, like, by the way, I know this wasn't in the commission, but can we have a singer? And he was like, maybe, sure. And then I realized I didn't want an opera singer. I didn't even want a classically trained singer, because I don't want it to be, singer versus audience. And there's something in that operatic quality. So I asked, like, is there someone in the violin section who wouldn't mind just getting up and sort of doing this intonation reciting? And he said, sure. And at our last funders salon, a donor salon, one of the violinists, Sarah Thornblade, stood up, and I said, like, look, just sing this. And she said, fine, great. And she's breathtakingly beautiful, exactly because she's a musician. You can tell she's a very kind person, and she just sang it. And this is a very long-winded answer to saying what the title is about. But so the title, HaZ'man, HaZeh, literally means this time, and it's about the battle, the internal struggle between nostalgia and sort of overt futurism. And so I try to reach that through a dialectic between song and then dance, and then something that's neither song nor dance, but that's just meditation at the end. And sort of that's where the title comes from.
Well, it's interesting on the heels of that answer, because I read your essay, Music, Emotions, and Language.
Mm-hmm.
And in the second paragraph, you say, we spend a lot of words on both music and emotions, but ultimately those words fail us. And I'm wondering, was there something in particular you wanted the music to express, more than just theme, but forcing you to go into the idea of emotion? Is there something that you wanted to get off your chest, or is it foolish of me to think that you could put that in words?
Yes and no. I mean, at this point, I have to caution you that with something one of my composition teachers told me, which has stood me in very good stead over the years, which is that composers lie about their music. They just do. It's reflexive. I mean, again, Stravinsky, there's no Russian folk music in my music. Like, I'm sorry, what? Or, Verdi lies about his own music. If you want to know what a composer is trying to express, this is what my teacher told me. Ask them who their favorite composer is and what piece resonates with them the most. And that they'll start talking about their own music. And so that's evasion number one. I'm sorry. Evasion number two. Let me see. Yes and no. Again, there's the whole Mendelssohn evasion. I'm sorry, I'm full of quotes. Where music begins where words leave off. It's an evasion. Having said that, I do find myself returning to the same themes of constancy, loss amidst constancy, and happiness in the midst of inevitable eternal loss. What does that mean? Whether you have to decide whether this should be an F sharp or an A flat, that I can't tell you. I mean, I can a little bit, but not, that would be a much longer discussion.
Can you tell me whether it should be an F sharp or a G flat?
Yes, that is a much more common. And don't get me started on that one, because there's a big difference.
I know there is.
There is. It's like you finger it differently. It's actually tuned differently. I'm sorry. This is me arguing with my students who let Sibelius notate their pieces for them. It's like, well, I play this on the piano and it's a G flat. And it's like, yes, but the cello's playing a D. You know how that's going to sound intonation wise? I mean, go for it. Handel did that. Handel goes from D to G flat when he's feeling really emotional. Do you feel really emotional now? I just pressed this button on my keyboard. Stop haranguing. Anyway, so.
Well, is this where I'm supposed to ask you who your favorite composer is and what piece inspires you?
You can. I'm at that point in life where I have serial favorite composers. And I think this is true of a lot of people who sort of somewhere between your late 40s and your 50s. I was really omnivorous before that. And I started listening to single composers really obsessively for anywhere from 4 to 8 months. And I had done a little of that. So I think when I turned 50, I put on the Koopman Bach cantatas on repeat for about 6 to 7 months, which was amazing. The only bad side effect is now I have no idea what the numbers are, because they're all like, I would sometimes put them on shuffle play and it's like, oh yeah, that one. But, goes like this. What is it? Anyway, and then was late Beethoven sonatas. And then Sofia Gubaidulina is probably one of my favorite living composers. And she is sort of an aesthetic model of mine in many ways. I mean, I write very different music than she does, but she's sort of one of my creative heroes in what she's able to do by mixing lots of different styles and being overtly emotively expressive, having actually structurally expressive forms, if that means anything. Actually, I think musical form can be very expressive, and hers almost always are to me. I mean, like any composer, not everything she writes is the best in the world, but a significant portion is, and that's amazing. It's like another one of my heroes, Ellington. He wrote 1,000 songs. 30 of them are classics. That's an incredible percentage, so I'm like, I have lots of favorite composers. I also am a complete Mahler head, and I had to stop at some point. I have a cousin who's a very good jazz sort of avant-garde jazz bass clarinetist, and I used to talk Mahler with him, and when our Mahler phases would intersect, and he was like, Mark, it's like you have a scab and you itch it and it starts to bleed again, and then it scabs over again. You can't stop it. You keep itching it again. If only because the psychological issues that Mahler deals with is the same sort of world that I live in. But I'm not quite as, I don't know, pretentious or something like that. Or, I mean, I'm a huge fan. I'm happy to admit I'm not as good. I'm just not in the same field. But so I would say for technique and aesthetics, Gubaidulina. For craft, Bach. Mahler. For sort of simplicity, Leonard Cohen. Somewhere around there.
Well, since you brought up, the themes that are built into Mahler, for instance, how important is it for an audience to understand what a composer is trying to get across versus just listening and enjoying it?
At its best, there's no difference. I just came across, I'm sorry, I'm just quoting other people, but that's what you're going to get. Sorry. I just came across a great Coltrane quote where, the great jazz critic Nat Hentoff often wrote the liner notes. And I think he wrote the liner notes for Love Supreme and a couple of those albums. And he, in an interview, he said, and he told the story a lot about, he would ask Coltrane, like, what can you tell me about the piece? Like, what do you want people to get out of it? Like, exactly sort of question, like, do I need to analyze this? And Coltrane would say, like, you just need to listen to the music. You should get everything just from listening to music. And then Hentoff would say, like, look, John, and he would call him John, of course, like, this is just a gig. I'm getting paid to do this. And he said, like, oh, okay, I get it. And then he would give something under duress because he realized that, they were friends and he had to help his friend out. Okay, in that case, say this, and this about the piece. And I feel, I mean, I think a lot of composers would say the same thing. We hope that there's explanation beneath it, but we certainly hope that explanation is not necessary. Having said that, a certain amount of linguistic fluency helps, or familiarity, let me put it that way. So, like, if you've never heard Andreessen before, you might be really put off by Die Stadt or something like that. However, on the sixth or seventh time, it's like it suddenly becomes a lot more powerful. So one of the issues today is sort of, as they're talking about, just as composers can get lost in the many styles that are around today, audiences, for their own good, might want to become a little fluent in things that they like, which is just to say, if you like something, listen to it and try to figure it out. The first listen might not be as rewarding as the fourth or the fifth, or maybe it is, or maybe it's not linear, something like that. Again, it's a very roundabout way of answering your questions. I hope you can tell that I'm being evasive about absolutely everything you ask.
I'm just going to call this interview Themes and Variations.
There we go. It's fine by me.
Now, the industry, for people who don't know, is a performing arts organization here in Los Angeles that has taken conventional wisdom about how you present opera or performance works and blown it completely out of the water.
Mm-hmm.
You were involved with Hopscotch, which I was able to see, which had attendees in various cars going on different routes around the city to see and hear different things in and outside that car. I hope that's a fairly succinct definition of it. But what I'm curious is, how much does working within an organization like that make you realize or feel that we are moving in a direction where traditional expectations of how art is to be presented or consumed and genres are becoming passé?
That's a really good question. I would rephrase it slightly, with your permission.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're being expanded beyond that which is passé, because one way to look at traditional opera, and let's talk about opera and not just symphonic music for a second. One way to look at traditional opera is sort of like those Civil War reenactments. I mean, there's a place for it, and people like that, and it's a history, and it's a culture, and it's a deep part of us. And it might be a little passé, but it's deeply important. There's a real place for the Met and for LA Opera and Chicago Lyric and all those places. At the same time, we can't live in the past. And yes, the industry has been very involved. One way we put it is we let me see how I can. Do you want the pretentious language version or the unpretentious language version?
Whichever one you think best suits your purpose.
Oh no, that was touche.
You don't think I'm going to make that choice for you?
Of course, no. Touche. No, I guess what I would say is to whatever the words use, problematize, interrogate, question the relationship between the audience member and the work. It's very set. If you think about going into an opera house, you know what your relationship to the work is. You've done some research, you read there's a program, it tells you who kills who off stage, etc. We're just not interested in that in the industry. But it's not even phrased as a negative. What we're really interested is saying, like, what is your relationship to this work? And that question is very often prompted by a physical dislocation, because the physical associations of being in the opera house are so strong. So we almost always do something that's either mobile or site specific or purpose built. And it makes it very hard to repeat our productions, I must say, because once you build out something and then it goes away, it's hard to do it again. So in addition to doing that show in limousines, we did a show in a working train station. We've built temporary wooden stages in outdoor parks. We've made design performances for the beach. We have done a couple things in traditional spaces. And so the shadow puppet there is from one of the works we actually did in Disney Hall. But even then we tried to sort of shake up the relationship of Disney Hall a little bit by having shadow puppets that I think Walt Disney would have been a little embarrassed by. If this is a G-rated interview, I can't exactly say what they are. But let's just say we tried to stay true to Lou Harrison's vision of shadow puppets and male genitalia. So in other words, there's nothing about the relationship that is set or pat. And something very interesting happens when you question that relationship between yourself and the work. And I'll take your look, you're in a car, where's the opera? Oh, the opera's in the car. Wait, the opera's on the street, I just passed it by. Wait, I'm getting out of the car, it's over here. And you can think of it as immersive theater, but I think it's something more than that. I think it's something a little subtler than that. It's always immersive theater for a purpose. And like I said, sometimes it's not exactly immersive. Sometimes you have to find it out. And so when we did Christopher Saron's Invisible Cities in Union Station, you literally had to find the opera yourself. People were wearing headphones, and you could hear the singing and you could hear the orchestra, but sometimes you couldn't see the singers, and you usually couldn't see the orchestra. So you were sort of lost in a train station looking for it. And you can have metaphors, like, what is that a metaphor for? But it is sort of search for meaning, and it's a search for the relationship, and it's a search for that kind of connection. And we always try to have that search be related to the topic itself. So the topic of Invisible Cities is a search for memory and meaning and exploration. So you have to explore. And sometimes it's overt, sometimes it's not. And Hopscotch is about literally non-linear leaping around through a very postmodern telling of a story, not knowing what the story is. Therefore, the physicality has to reflect that. And when we just did Sweetland right before the COVID lockdowns, it was very much about the land being a participant because it was about land and indigenous erasure. So we built structures on the land, but then we sort of panned out. So the land was actually sort of part of the production itself. So, we're not just problematizing the relationship between you and what you think of as opera. We're really trying to express something about the work that's created along the lines. And we're using that modality as part of the expressivity of the work.
Well, then I'm going to take something that Yuval told me, Yuval Sharon, for people who are watching this. I spoke to him around the time of Invisible Cities, because I also saw Invisible Cities and I saw Sweetland. I saw Sweetland actually 3 times.
Wow.
But he told me that the quote, the inner life of the piece of music has to be made manifest on a stage. Now, clearly he was talking about an opera in the case of Invisible Cities. But does that same thought process become part of what you think about when you're composing something for a concert hall?
It's a really good question. And, I have to think. There's many fields in which to answer that question. One is just vocalism. I mean, I actually grew up as an opera singer, and I work in an opera company. I've written a couple operas. I wrote for Hopscotch. I wrote a couple of the scenes. And so here I was writing this orchestra piece for Lake. I was like, great, no singing. And then, of course, what happens is, like, hello, does anyone in the orchestra sing? You know, so there is that sort of connection of the voice, and that's something that's different from opera, that sort of differentiates opera from even songs in symphonies. Although I would argue that Mahler is pretty much an opera-ish composer. His symphonies are sort of operas in that sense. And the but like they're different from an oratorio, different from a song, different from Strauss songs. There is the sort of inner drama that connects us to the human voice that has all sorts of technical ramifications when you're writing. You must write for voice differently, if only because we psychologically perceive the voice so differently. You know, you can recognize 10,000 different human voices. You cannot recognize 10,000 different oboe players. You just can't. So you have to have this different mindset when writing for the voice, whether you do it consciously or not. We just do. So that's number one. And opera really is about, even if it's non-narrative, telling a story or a scenario with the use of human voice. So to that extent, it's always going to be a little different from the symphony orchestra and the orchestra hall. Once you're in the orchestra hall, it's a little bit more pictures of the mind. In other words, you're transported away from a physical space, which is why, I mean, I love site-specific concert music that doesn't have voices, but why I think there's always going to be a home for these really beautifully acoustically tuned halls that allow you to immerse yourself in either electronic, acoustic, or some kind of sound world so that you can project yourself into the sound. And I think that's fundamentally different than what happens in opera, where it's a story and you project yourself into the story or the narrative or the scenario, even with music that's programmatic. I just think it's a fundamental difference. So when you try to problematize the symphony hall, it's going to be different, and we should. It's going to be different than problematizing the operatic stage, because, yeah, just that. I mean, let me put it this way. I think you can listen to an opera in a recording, and I think you only really get it if you've seen it on the stage. But that's not true of orchestra music. You can listen to wonderful orchestra music in a recording and really get it, you know, and really get it in a way that you just can't get opera. And almost everyone who listens to opera, which is probably not a lot of people, have almost always seen the work before, or have seen a video of it, or it's always marketed with visuals in a way to sort of bring you into that story. And this isn't arguing for one form over the other. I just think we have to recognize the fundamental difference, which of course will have blurred lines in between it, but I think they are different. And it was very challenging to me. I mean, you know, in that sense of writing a strictly orchestrational piece, and some would say I failed because there's a singer at the end.
Yeah, but did Beethoven fail by, you know, with the ninth? I mean, one could argue he did
Right.
pretty well by that one.
Yeah.
Well,
No,
so
no.
Beethoven's ninth has had thousands upon thousands of performances.
Yeah.
The challenge for work that gets debuted today is how do you cut through an original
Right.
one or two performances, as you will have with Lako, so that
Mhm.
other ensembles, other orchestras will be interested in picking up your work and continuing its development in the awareness of the public.
Mhm.
Is that something that you address before it gets performed, or you hope that that happens as a result of the response to the performance?
Excuse me. Yes, and I mean, I have to say that I'm learning late-ish in life the importance of sort of networking and marketing. If only because, like I said, I've had these sort of three parallel careers going, so I've always been just crazy busy with them. And ironically, I'm learning from my younger peers who are very good networkers that it's not just a necessity, it's actually, you know, it's part of the art form, it's part of the work. So I'm sort of just learning how to network, and that's part of it, is sort of making connections and say like, hey, do you want to do this? Part of it is getting a cogent performance, absolutely. But part of it is just sort of the marketing aspect. And it's been difficult since COVID. It's put this big lumps in everybody's repertoire. You know, they have this big backlog of modern pieces that they're now all doing. And I would say the scene is much more chaotic now. But that's not bad, you know, in a sense. People are searching. So I'm certainly going to do my best to market the piece. I hope it has a life. We all hope that, you know, what does that exactly mean? I don't know.
I like to finish the interviews that I do by coming up with a quote that I hope somehow ties into this. And I have to tell you that the quote I selected, I did randomly without knowing anything about what your piece was about. But since nostalgia is partially at the core of what this is,
Mhm.
ironically, I found a quote by Ray Bradbury.
Aha.
where he said, "No sound once made is ever truly lost. In electric clouds, all are safely trapped, and with a touch, if we find them, we can recapture those echoes of sad forgotten wars, long summers, and sweet autumns." So, Marc, how would you like your music and this work in particular, once safely trapped, to help listeners recapture their own memories and experiences?
That's a good. I listened to Ray Bradbury. I mean, I read Ray Bradbury obsessively when I was, 12 and 14, and he's definitely steeped in that same sort of nostalgia that I talk about. I don't know. I don't know that the music has a message that I want to give out. I hope it's successful on its own terms. I would almost unask that question, in that you tell me. I'm much more interested in how other people react to it. Like I know what the sounds are. I know how it sounds. I cannot predict whether it's even partially universal in expressing what I'm trying to express, or if other people get other things from it. That's always the case, and there's been many pieces that people interpret as one thing and that the composer meant something else. So I had no good answer. I hope it's successful. I hope people hear it. I hope it's successful on its own terms, if that means something. And I still kind of discovering what those own terms are. It's a very unsatisfying answer.
Well, which means I'm not going to let you go with that answer. So
yeah,
there's a great saying that, great art is never finished, it's just abandoned. Is this work finished in your heart and in your mind?
yes, and it's part of my other work. It's part of my teaching. It's part of my sort of collaborative work in the industry. I feel that there is a sort of a through line, and this piece is part of it. I think it's a finished piece of it, and through our work in the industry, I've actually gotten very good at letting go of things. I mean, oh my God, Invisible Cities should be performed again. Hopscotch should be Sweetland. But at the same time, I'm very good at saying, okay, let's do the next best thing after that. And that is living in the present. And that is sort of the message of this piece, is in fact to let it go and to just do the next thing, and to find your next mantra, and to live in the next moment, because that's literally all that there is. And this is something I try to impart to my students as well when I'm teaching music theory, which is another one of my obsessions, which is, it relates to this, which is, I really don't think there's any such thing as music theory, and yet I teach it. It's one of my life's professions, and I try to teach them that, or I try to get them to find their own path through this exact sort of realization that it's through technical awareness is not the enemy of expressivity. It's like the same kind of duality, and that not only that, but expressivity is itself this ephemeral thing, and it's only by sort of working through your technique and expanding your technique and working through and writing more, and as I said, letting go of things. It's only by letting go and having a tremendous amount of throughput, I think, that you can really find the meaning in the moment.
Terrific. I've really enjoyed our conversation, Marc. I look